The trauma room went dark at 2:47 in the morning, and the man strapped to the gurney stopped screaming. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Sergeant First Class Damon Voss, 210 pounds of Special Forces operator with a through-and-through gunshot wound in his left shoulder, and something much worse happening inside his abdomen, ripped the IV line out of his arm, threw a security guard into a crash cart, and put a second one through the drywall. And Olivia Hayes, night shift nurse, the woman 3 different residents had called the wallpaper this week alone, stepped forward into the dark and said quietly, "Voss, stand down." He stopped. The entire emergency department of Hargrove Regional Medical Center stopped with him. Chad, if you've been watching from the beginning, thank you. Stay with me all the way to the end of this story, because what happens next is going to change everything you think you know about the woman nobody bothered to see. Hit subscribe so you don't miss a single part. Drop a like if this already has your heart going, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hargrove Regional Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Caldwell, a mid-sized industrial city that smelled like river water and old concrete, the kind of place where the hospital parking lot flooded every March, and the board of directors still hadn't fixed the drainage because the money kept going somewhere else. The building itself was a patchwork of 3 different construction decades. The original brick wing from the 70s, the glass and steel trauma center addition from 2003, and the recently renovated surgical suites on the 4th floor that smelled like fresh paint over mold. It was not a prestigious institution. It was a busy one. There was a difference. Olivia Hayes had worked the night shift in the emergency department for 14 months. She had transferred in from a rural clinic in eastern Oregon with paperwork that was technically complete and references that checked out, and a work history with one significant gap that her nurse manager, Sandra Pruitt, had flagged twice and then filed because the references were strong and the night shift was perpetually short-staffed. She was 31 years old, medium height, dark hair she kept in a low bun, so tight it looked almost militant. She had a small scar running along the left side of her jaw that she'd told exactly one person was from a car accident, and she wore long sleeves even in August. She was competent, quiet, and efficient in a way that made people assume she was simple rather than careful. She answered questions when asked. She didn't offer opinions. She did her job and then she went home, and nobody at Hargrove Regional Medical Center knew a single real thing about her. That was exactly how she'd planned it. The night Sergeant Voss came in. Olivia was 40 minutes into a 12-hour shift that had already given her a pediatric asthma attack, a construction worker with 3 broken ribs, and a woman in her 60s who'd had a minor stroke and kept asking where her cat was. The ER was running at about 70% capacity, busy but not overwhelmed. And Dr. Victor Kane was the attending on duty, which meant the atmosphere had that particular texture it always had when Kane was in charge. Efficient, cold, and subtly hostile to anyone he hadn't personally approved of. Victor Kane was 54, silver-haired, and carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had never had a serious professional consequence in his life. He'd trained at a good program, published 3 papers in the 90s that people still occasionally cited, and parlayed that into a chief surgeon role at Hargrove that he treated less like a medical position and more like a property he owned. He had a habit of addressing nurses by their job titles instead of their names, not the interns, just the nurses, and a particular talent for delivering corrections in front of other people. He wasn't the worst doctor Olivia had ever worked under. He was thorough, technically skilled, and fast in a trauma bay. But he had a ranking system in his head, and he applied it constantly, and nurses, particularly nurses who hadn't come from the programs he respected, were somewhere near the bottom. Olivia he had sorted, within her first week, into a category that was roughly equivalent to furniture. Hayes. He'd stopped in front of her during rounds on her 3rd shift. "You prepped the Halverson consult?" "Yes, Dr. Kane. Labs are pulled, imaging is queued." "I didn't ask for an inventory. Yes or no?" "Yes." "Good." And he'd moved on without looking at her again. That was the template. She had never once heard him say her first name. The call came through the radio at 11:22 p.m. Military convoy, Route 9 overpass, 2 vehicles down, multiple casualties, ETA 14 minutes. Olivia was restocking a trauma cart when she heard it and went still for just a moment. the way she sometimes did when something registered on a frequency the rest of the room wasn't quite tuned to. Military convoy, Route 9, multiple casualties. She finished restocking the cart, washed her hands, and positioned herself near Trauma Bay 1. The first ambulance brought a specialist with a broken collarbone and a laceration above his left eye. Alert, stable, already trying to argue with the paramedics about whether he needed a backboard. The second brought Sergeant First Class Damon Voss. He came in strapped to a gurney, which was the first thing Olivia clocked, because a man that size didn't end up in restraints unless he'd already shown the paramedics something. His left shoulder had a field dressing over it. Someone had done decent work in transit, pressure applied correctly. No arterial bleed evident. He was conscious. He was not, in any recognizable sense, calm. His eyes were moving with the fast, systematic quality of a man scanning a perimeter, and his breathing was wrong. Not from pain, exactly. From something else. 34-year-old male, GSW left shoulder, through and through, vitals are... The paramedics started the handoff, but Voss's right hand had already closed around the side rail of the gurney, hard enough that the metal made a sound. "Get them off me!" His voice was low and controlled and absolute. "Get the straps off." "Sir, we need to..." "Get them off." Kane arrived at the bay entrance, glanced at the chart, glanced at Voss. "Keep him restrained. What are we looking at?" "Through and through, GSW, left shoulder. BP's elevated. Pulse is... I can see that." Kane moved to the head of the bed with the smooth efficiency that Olivia could grudgingly admit was impressive. "Sergeant, I'm Dr. Kane. I'm the attending. We're going to take care of that shoulder, and I need you to stay..." "Where's my team?" Not a question. A demand issued at a specific frequency. "Your team is being taken care of. I need you to..." "Where's my team?" Louder now. Olivia was standing 4 feet back, positioned where she was supposed to be, behind the residents, out of the primary physician's sight line, close enough to hand off equipment or back up the IV placement that the second year was already fumbling. She was watching Voss the way she'd learned to watch a space, taking in all of it at once, not fixating. The overhead fluorescence in Trauma Bay 1 had a flicker. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a half-second stutter in the lighting that facilities had been supposed to fix for 6 months. Most people filtered it out. Olivia had noticed it on her first night and never stopped noticing it. She watched Damon Voss's eyes every time the light stuttered. His pupils snapped wide. His jaw went rigid. His right hand, which had been gripping the rail, went to the restraint on his left wrist and started working the buckle with the single-minded focus of a man who had been in this specific situation before and had learned in the hardest possible way what happened when you couldn't move. "He's going to breach the restraints," Olivia said. The second-year resident, Marcus Webb, glanced at her. Kane didn't. "I've got this, Hayes, thank you," Kane said, which was his standard way of telling her to be quiet. 12 seconds later, Damon Voss pulled his left wrist free, sat up, hit the male security guard reaching for him with a controlled palm heel strike that sent the man into the crash cart. The cart skidded 4 feet and took out an IV stand, and then went off the gurney entirely. The trauma bay became a controlled chaos. Webb scrambled backward. The nurse on Kane's right flattened herself against the wall. The second security guard came through the bay entrance at a run, radio already up, and Voss turned toward him with the look of a man who had about 3 seconds of rational cognition left before pure muscle memory took over. Olivia moved to the light panel beside the bay entrance. She'd noted its location on her first shift. She'd noted the location of every light panel in the department within her first week, without particularly deciding to, the way she noted exit routes and blind spots and the 6-second delay in the security camera feed on the east corridor. Some habits were simply structural. She switched off the overheads. The trauma bay dropped into the dimmer, warmer glow of the emergency strips along the floor and the monitor screens. The flicker was gone, and in the sudden quiet of the changed light, Damon Voss stood in the center of the bay and breathed. Olivia walked toward him steadily, no rush, keeping her hands visible at her sides and her footsteps deliberate, heel, toe, heel, toe. The way you moved when you needed someone to hear you coming and not feel hunted by the sound. "Voss?" She kept her voice level. Not soft, exactly. Soft could read as uncertainty, and uncertainty was the wrong message. Even. Certain. You're safe. The mission is over. He turned toward her. In the dim light, she could see his eyes were tracking, really tracking, not just reacting, and that the smallest percentage of him was still in the room. She stopped 2 feet away, close enough to be present, far enough to give him the space to choose. Listen to the building, she said. HVAC, single unit, no birds, no wind. He breathed. The rigidity in his shoulders dropped by a fraction. The vehicle noise outside is city traffic. One-way street, consistent pattern. You're not in the field. Another breath. She watched his hands come open. Your team came in on the second unit, she said. I don't have specifics, but the convoy report said multiple casualties, and they went to 2 different bays. That means they were conscious enough to be split up by severity. Unconscious patients don't get split. It was a calculated thing to say. She didn't actually know which unit his team had arrived on or what their condition was, but she knew what that information meant to a man like this, and she knew the reasoning would track because it was the reasoning his own training would use. His right hand lowered. Sit down, she said. Let me look at that shoulder. Damon Voss sat down on the edge of the gurney. The security guard he'd hit was being helped to his feet by a colleague. The crash cart had dented the wall. Marcus Webb was breathing like he'd run 100 meters. Kane was standing at the bay entrance with an expression that was almost, not quite, but almost, blank. Olivia gloved up and began assessing the shoulder. The through and through was clean in terms of the trajectory. No major vessels compromised. The field dressing had controlled the bleed effectively. She replaced the gauze, checked the exit wound, noted the entry angle. Her hands moved without hesitation. She was aware that Kane had moved back into the bay, aware that Webb was trying to look useful, aware of all of it in her peripheral attention, the way she was always aware of everything around her. Not anxiously, just accurately. What she was paying more attention to was Voss himself. His respirations were slightly fast for a man who'd just stopped fighting. That was expected. But there was a quality to his breathing, a shallow catch at the top of each inhale, that didn't match the shoulder wound. Shoulder pain compressed respiration differently. This catch was lower. And when she'd helped guide him back to the gurney, his abdomen had been rigid under her forearm in a way that a man with only a shoulder wound's abdomen had no reason to be. Dr. Kane, she said, I'll take it from here, Hayes. I think there's a secondary injury. His abdomen is... He took a shoulder wound. We have the imaging cued. I can see the chart. The abdominal rigidity doesn't match. Kane turned toward her with the particular patience of a man explaining something to someone who should know better than to speak. He was just in a physical altercation in this room. Post-adrenaline muscle rigidity is not an abdominal injury. Thank you. She looked at him for 1 second. Then she looked at Voss. Voss was watching her with eyes that were still moving systematically around the bay, but when her gaze met his, something in his expression shifted. Not recognition. They had never met. Something more specific than that. The way one professional recognizes something in another that has no official name. She stepped back. She documented her observation in the nursing notes, time-stamped, specific, clinical language, abdomen rigid on palpation, patient reports, no abdominal trauma, recommend assessment, and she kept moving. That was at 11:51 p.m. At 12:23 a.m., Damon Voss's blood pressure dropped 12 points in 4 minutes. Olivia was at the nurse's station when the monitor alarm went off, and she was through the bay entrance before the sound had finished registering. She saw the numbers, saw the rate, saw the pattern, and said, "He's bleeding internally, probably splenic. He needs a surgeon now." Kane was 20 feet away, already turning, already moving, his face doing that thing faces did when the body knew something before the mind caught up. "Get a trauma ultrasound in here," he said. Not to Olivia, to Webb. But the order was the right one. The fast exam took 90 seconds. Fluid in the abdomen, unmistakable, more than should be there. "OR's on standby," someone called. Voss went into cardiac arrest at 12:31 a.m. It was V-fib, which was actually the better of the available options in that specific crisis, and Olivia had the defibrillator charged before Kane finished ordering it. She ran the code with the kind of focused, sequenced efficiency that nobody in that room had seen from her before. Not because she'd been hiding it exactly, but because nobody had been looking. She called the rhythm, timed the compressions, coordinated the medication administration with a certainty that didn't waver and didn't over-communicate. 2 shocks. Return of spontaneous circulation at 12:34 a.m. 3 minutes and 19 seconds. She stepped back as the OR team took over, already moving, already preparing to transport. She pulled off her gloves, dropped them in the bin, and went to update the chart. Webb was standing near the bay entrance, staring at her with the expression of someone who had just watched a magic trick and was trying to understand which hand the coin was actually in. "Where did you—" he started. "I'm going to check on Bay 3, she said. She was almost out of the department before she heard Kane's voice behind her, talking to the unit coordinator. She wasn't meant to hear it. Or maybe he didn't care whether she did. "Pull her file," he said. "I want to know what we actually know about where she came from." Olivia kept walking. The east corridor was quiet at that hour. The overnight security guard was doing his rounds on the second floor, and the hallway was empty except for the hum of the vending machine near the elevator bank and the distant murmur of the cardiac monitoring suite. Olivia walked to the end of the corridor, turned left, and stood for a moment at the window that faced the parking structure. The parking lot lights cast everything in that flat amber that cities never quite managed to make look like daylight. She could see the ambulance bay from this angle, and she could see, parked near the service entrance, a dark-colored SUV with government plates she hadn't seen there when her shift started. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she went back to work. The rest of the shift was what the rest of the shift was. A laceration requiring 12 stitches, a diabetic complication, and an elderly man who hadn't been managing his insulin correctly. A young woman whose panic attack had convinced her she was dying, and whom Olivia had spent 20 minutes with in the only quiet curtained bay, talking in the measured way she'd learned made most people's nervous systems settle until the woman's breathing had come back to something manageable. It was 5 a.m. before the department had its first real lull. She was charting at the station when Sandra Pruitt appeared in the doorway of the supervisor's office and said, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they'd been asked to deliver, "Dr. Kane wants to see you before you leave." Olivia saved her chart entry and stood up. Kane's office was technically a shared space, but nobody else used it when he was in the building. He was at the desk when she came in, the door already open, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had been rehearsing what he was about to say. That was never a good sign. "Close the door," he said. She did. "You intervened in a patient interaction tonight outside the scope of your clinical role." She waited. "You deactivated the overhead lighting in Trauma Bay 1 without physician authorization. You made physical contact with a combative patient without physician authorization. You provided clinical assessment orally to me in front of the team that contradicted my evaluation." She waited. "Hargrove has a protocol for patient behavioral emergencies. That protocol involves security personnel and, when indicated, chemical sedation. You bypassed that protocol." "The patient would have sustained injuries if I hadn't," she said, "and so would staff. That is not your determination to make. With respect, Dr. Kane, it was the correct determination." He looked at her then. Really looked, the way he rarely bothered to, and she could see him trying to square the person he'd sorted into his category of furniture with the person who'd run a resuscitation in his trauma bay at 12:31 in the morning with the economy of motion of someone who'd done it before. Many times. "Your file," he said, "has a gap." "I'm aware." 17 months between your previous military auxiliary position and your intake at the Oregon clinic. No employer record, no clinical activity, no continuing education documentation. "I was dealing with a family situation," she said. It was the cover she'd used before. It had the advantage of being unanswerable in a professional context. Nobody pressed you on family situations. And the disadvantage of being exactly the kind of answer that made cautious people more cautious. Kane was a cautious person about his specific categories of thing. "I'm initiating a performance review," he said. "Pending that review, I'm restricting your practice to non-acute patient care. You will not be present in trauma bays without a supervising physician's explicit request." She held herself very still. "Dr. Kane, Sergeant Voss is alive because Sergeant Voss is in the OR, and if he survives, it will be because the OR team did their job. That is outside the scope of what we're discussing. He picked up his pen in the way people picked up pens when a conversation was over. You can go. She left without another word. In the locker room, she sat on the bench for 43 seconds with her hands flat on her thighs and breathed at a measured rate. Then she changed out of her scrubs, put her things in her bag, and walked out into the early morning. The dark SUV was still in the service parking area. She didn't look at it directly. She walked to her car, put her bag in the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel for a moment looking at the hospital's east entrance. Through the glass doors she could see the lobby, the security desk, the tired geometry of an institution that had been housing human catastrophe for 40 years and would keep doing it long after everyone currently inside had moved on. She had worked in worse places. She had worked in places where the infrastructure was a helicopter and the ceiling was the actual sky. She started the car and drove home. Her apartment was 12 minutes away, a second-floor unit in a building that had a broken elevator and a landlord who responded to maintenance requests in order of their own convenience rather than hers. She had chosen it because it had 2 exits and the bedroom window accessed the fire escape. Old habits were structural. She made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and watched the street below begin its early morning negotiations with itself. A bakery truck, a man walking a dog, a woman in scrubs, night shift ending, walking quickly toward the bus stop with the particular posture of someone who had been on her feet for 12 hours. Olivia had been on her feet for 12 hours too. She wasn't particularly tired. She was instead running the calculation she'd been running for 14 months. How long, in a place like Hargrove Regional, before the gaps in her story became a problem she couldn't manage? The answer had always been longer than she was planning to stay. Victor Kane had moved the timeline. She set the coffee down, went to the bedroom, pulled the lockbox from under the floorboard beneath the closet, and opened it. Inside were 2 passports, a prepaid phone, a folded piece of paper with 4 phone numbers written in pencil, and a photograph she didn't look at. She took out the prepaid phone, turned it on for the first time in 11 months, and waited for it to connect to the network. 1 message, received 6 weeks ago from a number she recognized. They found the convoy logs. It's starting to move. She looked at the message for a long time. Then she put the phone in her pocket, went back to the kitchen, picked up her coffee, and stood at the window watching the street until the sun cleared the buildings to the east and filled the apartment with the kind of plain, unheroic morning light that promised nothing and meant everything. Somewhere across the city, in the operating room on the 4th floor of Hargrove Regional Medical Center, a surgeon was working to repair the damage inside Damon Voss that nobody had seen until it almost killed him. And in the service parking area, the dark SUV with government plates that Olivia had been pretending not to notice since 11:30 p.m. had not moved. It was still there when she looked out her window at 6:45 a.m. It was parked facing east, facing specifically the direction of her building. She finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and went to get dressed. She changed into dark jeans and a gray long-sleeve shirt, laced up her boots, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment doing nothing. The phone was still in her pocket. The message was still on it. They found the convoy logs. It's starting to move. 6 weeks of silence after that, which could mean a dozen different things, none of them comfortable. She'd spent those 6 weeks doing the same thing she always did when the ground shifted under her. She worked. She kept her head down. She gave people no reason to look twice. Victor Kane had just given her a reason to look twice. She stood up, tucked the phone into the inside pocket of her jacket, and went downstairs. The building's front door had a warped frame that you had to pull toward you while turning the handle, or it stuck, which had annoyed her for approximately the first 3 days, and now she didn't think about it. She went out to the street, turned right, and walked 2 blocks to the corner store that opened at 6 and sold decent coffee and bad breakfast sandwiches, and she bought both because she hadn't eaten since the granola bar at 10 p.m., and her body ran better on something than nothing. She ate the sandwich on the walk back. It was, as advertised, bad. She ate it anyway. Back in the apartment, she sat at the small kitchen table with the second coffee and pulled out her personal phone, her real one, registered under her actual name, Caldwell billing address, unremarkable data usage, and opened the hospital employee portal. She had access until the performance review was formally processed. That usually took 48 hours. She pulled Voss's chart. He'd come out of the OR at 4:52 a.m. Splenic repair, successful. He was in the surgical ICU on the third floor, listed as stable. The post-op notes were Kane's, thorough, technically precise, giving no indication that anything in that trauma bay had happened outside the expected sequence of events. The nursing notes from the code were intact, including hers, time-stamped, and clinical. She scrolled to the bottom of the nursing assessment section. Her documentation of the abdominal rigidity was there. The timestamp read 11:58 p.m., 33 minutes before he crashed. She stared at that timestamp for a while. Then she closed the portal, finished her coffee, and tried to sleep. She managed about 4 hours, fragmented, surface level, the kind of sleep that checked a biological box without actually resting anything, and woke up at noon to 3 texts from Sandra Pruitt and a voicemail from the hospital's HR department that she didn't listen to yet. Sandra's texts were apologetic in the way institutional texts always were, careful and impersonal, and worded to survive a review. Dr. Kane has submitted a formal restriction request. HR will be in contact. Please respond when available. The second one, I want you to know I've requested to see the documentation before anything is finalized. The third, sent 40 minutes after the first 2. Olivia, call me. She called her. Sandra picked up on the second ring. Hey! Her voice was lower than usual, which meant she wasn't at her desk. You okay? I'm fine. That was what you did last night. What you did in that bay. I've been here 11 years and I've never seen anyone run a code like that. The patient needed it. Victor is... Sandra stopped, started again. He submitted the restriction request at 4 in the morning, before the patient was even out of the OR. Olivia, that's not a standard response. That's someone who's scared. Olivia looked at the ceiling. Scared of what? I don't know, but he pulled your HR file personally, which he doesn't have standing to do without cause, and the way he's... Another pause. Just be careful. Whatever's in that gap in your work history, make sure it's solid, because he's going to dig. I appreciate you telling me. I'm not doing you any favors. I'm telling you because you saved that man's life and Victor Kane is trying to file paperwork about it, and that makes me... Sandra exhaled. Just call HR back. Don't ignore it. It looks worse. After she hung up, Olivia sat in the quiet of the apartment for a while. Victor Kane was scared. That was interesting. Not of her specifically. Men like Kane didn't frame their anxieties in terms of individual nurses who'd shown them up. They framed them as institutional order violations, chain of command breaches, protocol deviations. They filed paperwork. What Kane was actually scared of was the question of what Olivia Hayes was. Because people who moved like she'd moved and made decisions like she'd made and had gaps in their histories like the one she had were anomalies. And anomalies in Kane's orderly taxonomic universe were threats. She went to the window again. The dark SUV was gone. She noted its absence the same way she'd noted its presence, without conclusion, with accuracy. She called HR back, got a recorded message, left her availability, and then spent 20 minutes doing nothing in particular. Standing, moving from room to room, not eating, not reading, the low-level restlessness of a body that had been trained out of true stillness and now paid for it in the quiet hours. Eventually, she put on her jacket and went outside. She walked. Not a destination, just movement. East on Caldwell's grid, through the older residential streets where the trees were big enough to have survived the last 50 years of city planning, past the small park where a woman was throwing a tennis ball for a dog who was deeply invested in the game and not at all tired of it, past the Vietnamese restaurant that didn't open until 4 and whose smell at any hour was enough to make you rearrange your afternoon. She had found Caldwell livable in the specific way she found most mid-sized industrial cities livable. There was infrastructure without pretension, neighborhood variation without sharp hostility, enough anonymity in the daily flow of people that one more quiet woman moving through it didn't generate interest. She was on her second loop of the park when the prepaid phone buzzed. She pulled it out. New message, same number as before. He's awake. He's asking for you. She stopped walking. The woman threw the tennis ball again. The dog exploded after it. Olivia turned and walked back toward her car. The surgical ICU had visiting protocols that were not technically flexible, but were, in practice, managed by the nursing staff on the floor according to their own assessment of the situation. Olivia had worked in enough hospitals to know how to navigate this. She arrived at Hargrove Regional at 3:15 p.m. in civilian clothes, went to the third-floor nurses' station, and introduced herself to the charge nurse, a compact man in his 50s named Garrett, who had the quietly authoritative manner of someone who had seen everything and was impressed by very little. "Olivia Hayes, I'm a nurse in the ED," she said. "Sergeant Voss came through my bay last night. I understand he's stable." Garrett looked at her with the particular assessment of someone whose job was deciding who got access to things. "He is. You're the one who—" He stopped. "The night team briefed us. He asked to see me." Garrett considered this for a moment that was neither short nor long. Then he said, 15 minutes. "He's not supposed to be talking much, so you do most of it." The SICU room was dim, monitors running their quiet rhythms, the particular atmosphere of a space that was managing the distance between alive and not with considerable technical effort. Damon Voss was in the bed, with the specific flatness of someone whose body had been through something it was still trying to account for. He was bigger than he'd looked on the gurney, broad through the shoulders, which surprised her slightly, given the dimensions of the gurney had been the same. He had a week's worth of beard and a bandage on his left shoulder that peeked out from the hospital gown, and his color was still not great, but his eyes were open and they were tracking, and they were, she noticed, already on the door when she came through it. "Hayes," he said. "Voss?" She pulled the chair to the bedside and sat. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone took my spleen apart." A pause. "How much of it did they keep?" "I'm not your surgical nurse. I can't—" "Rough estimate." She had read the OR notes. "Most of it. The repair was clean." He nodded. His right hand was resting on the bed rail in a way that looked casual and wasn't, because nothing about how this man held himself was casual. "You were the one who killed the lights." "Yes." "And the restraint hold?" "Yes." "You didn't learn that in nursing school." She met his eyes. "No." He looked at her for a long moment. The monitors beeped their steady beeps. Somewhere down the hall, a different alarm went off and was silenced within 4 seconds, which was actually fast. 37 Bravo, he said. It was not a question. It was a classification. Special Forces Medical Sergeant. She didn't answer. "The way you moved. The technique on the wrist. And the way you talked me down. That was a specific protocol. TCCC cross-trained for psych response. I've only seen that in 2 contexts." "You should rest," she said. "I will." He shifted slightly, and the effort of it showed in his jaw, which he controlled. "I want to know who you are, before whatever's coming next." "Whatever's coming next," she said. "They didn't brief me fully in the field before the convoy moved, but I know what convoy it was." His voice was level, the words measured, the way someone talked when they had a limited energy budget and were spending it carefully. "Route 9 isn't a standard transit corridor. The vehicles that hit us knew our route. That's not a coincidence, and the people who set the route aren't going to want questions about how it leaked." He looked at the ceiling, which means the people who already have questions are in a dangerous spot. Olivia said nothing for a moment. Then, "Get some rest, Sergeant. You had a significant surgery." "I know what I had." He turned his head toward her. "There's an officer coming to debrief me. Tomorrow morning, probably. He's going to ask me about the convoy. I'm going to tell him the truth about what I know. And part of what I know is what I saw in that bay." He paused. "I don't know your story. I don't need to, but I know you didn't come from a nursing program." She stood up. 15 minutes, she said. "I don't want Garrett to change his mind about access." "One thing." She stopped. "Whatever they're trying to do to you downstairs, the paperwork, the restriction, you saved my life. I'm not going to sit in this bed and pretend I don't know that." She looked at him for a moment. He had the look of a man who meant what he said, which was not the same as the look of a man who could do anything about it from a surgical ICU bed with a repaired spleen. "Get some rest," she said, and left. In the elevator going down, she stood in the back corner and breathed. The doors opened on the second floor, and a transport aide got on with an empty wheelchair, and they rode the rest of the way in silence. And when the doors opened on the lobby, Olivia walked out into the late afternoon light coming through the hospital's front glass and thought, very specifically, about the message on the prepaid phone. They found the convoy logs. It's starting to move. The convoy that had brought Damon Voss in had taken Route 9. Route 9 was not a standard transit corridor. The vehicles that hit them had known the route. The logs would show who had set the route. She pushed through the front door and walked into the parking lot, and she was 3 rows from her car when a man fell into step beside her. He was tall, late 40s, in a dark jacket over a collared shirt that had the specific non-casual casualness of someone who wore a uniform most of the time and was in civilian clothes at the moment for a reason. He had gray at his temples and a face that had been through weather, and he walked with the particular ease of a person who had been in more uncomfortable situations than a hospital parking lot, and did not find hospital parking lots stressful. "Ms. Hayes," he said. She kept walking. "I don't know you." "No, my name is Ethan Cross. I'm a colonel with the Defense Intelligence Agency." He said it the way someone stated a fact that was checkable. "I've been in Caldwell since yesterday evening." "That was your SUV?" A half-second pause. "Yes." She reached her car, put her keys out, and then didn't unlock it yet. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time. He was doing the same, assessing, not hostile, the way professionals assessed each other when both of them were trying to determine how much the other knew. "What do you want?" she said. "To talk. Not here." He glanced toward the hospital entrance without appearing to. "There's a coffee place 2 blocks north called Brennan's. It's not busy this time of day. I'm not going anywhere with someone I met in a parking lot." "Fair." He reached into his jacket and produced a credentials folder, held it open in front of her without extending it past his own space. DIA identification photograph, Colonel Ethan Cross. "You can verify those however you want. The number on the card goes to a real desk." She looked at the credentials. She looked at him. Why would DIA be interested in a nurse who works in an emergency department? "We're not," he said. "We're interested in a Route 9 convoy ambush, a set of missing transport authorization logs, and a casualty record that's been altered 3 times in 6 years." A pause. "And you're interested in those things too, aren't you?" The parking lot was quiet around them. Someone 2 rows over was loading grocery bags into a minivan with the distracted speed of a person who had 3 other things to accomplish today. "Brennan's," she said. "I follow in my own car." "Of course." Brennan's was the kind of place that had been a diner at some point and had gentrified halfway and then stopped. The booths were original vinyl, cracked at the seams, but the menu was written on a chalkboard and the coffee was better than it had any right to be. She arrived 2 minutes after Cross did and sat across from him in the back booth, where she could see the entrance and he'd clearly chosen for the same reason. The coffee came without them asking for it, which told her the waitress recognized Cross, which told her he'd been here before, which told her this meeting wasn't as spontaneous as it had been positioned. "You've been in Caldwell longer than yesterday," she said. 4 days, he said, without apology. "I wanted to understand the environment before making contact. And the SUV last night. When the convoy came in, I needed to know who was working the receiving end." She looked at her coffee. "So you watched me run a code?" "I watched the building. The observation was incidental." He folded his hands on the table. He wore a plain watch, no rings, nothing that caught light. "Sergeant Voss was one of 3 personnel on that convoy who should not have survived. The other 2 didn't." She held herself still. The convoy's route was set through a logistics channel that routes through a specific records management office. That office processed 14 transport authorizations last year. 6 of those involved personnel connected to a classified operation that was formally closed in. And I'm going to use a specific year because I want to see if you react. 2018. She didn't react. Or rather, she did, but not externally, because she'd had years of practice at keeping external and internal on different tracks. "You already know about 2018, he said, not an accusation, a calibration. "Tell me what you think you know," she said, "and I'll tell you whether it's accurate." He looked at her steadily. In the spring of 2018, a small team of military personnel was conducting a classified support operation in a location I'm not going to name in a coffee shop. That operation went wrong. There were 7 people on the team. 6 were listed as killed in action. 1 was listed as killed in action, then quietly moved to a separate casualty file. And then he stopped. The file was closed with a notation that read, non-recoverable, which is an interesting notation for someone who is currently sitting across from me drinking coffee. The waitress refilled his cup without being asked. He thanked her. She left. 7 people, Olivia said. Yes. The rescue authorization was issued and then canceled, 17 minutes after it was issued while the team was still in the field. The cancellation came from a logistics command office. The person who issued it is currently a civilian. He retired from the military in 2020 with a clean record. Something in her jaw tightened. It was the only thing that moved. The 2 personnel who died in the Route 9 ambush, she said, were they from the 2018 operation? No, but they were involved in a separate inquiry that was beginning to intersect with the same records office, which is the kind of coincidence that isn't. He looked at her. Someone is cleaning house. The convoy ambush wasn't random. It was targeted. Voss wasn't supposed to survive it. The diner was quiet around them. An old man near the window was working through a piece of pie with the focused attention of someone treating it as the main event of the afternoon. 2 women at the counter were talking about something that involved a lot of emphasis. You've been building a case, she said. We've been trying to. The problem is that the primary documentary evidence, the original mission logs, the rescue authorization and its cancellation record, the casualty file amendments, those materials are held in a record system that the people we're investigating have access to. Anytime we get close to the documentation, it moves. He put his hands flat on the table. We need someone who can identify what the original record said. Someone who was there. And you think that's me? I know it's you, Ms. Hayes. I know who you were before you came to Caldwell. I know your military record up to April 2018. I know that the casualty notation that closed your file doesn't match the standard notation format for actual KIA determinations. And I know that somebody went back and altered it 18 months after the fact, which you'd only do if the original entry was a placeholder and the person doing the placing intended to come back to it. He stopped. Someone was protecting you. Someone in that office. And that person is the reason you're alive. And also probably the reason you've been moving every 16 to 20 months for the last 6 years. Olivia looked at the coffee cup. The ceramic had a small chip on the rim that someone had tried to smooth with their thumb a long time ago. The person who altered my record, she said. Is that person part of your case? They're not a target. They're a witness, and they've been trying to reach you. He reached into his jacket and put a photograph on the table. A man in his 50s, civilian clothes, photographed outside a building she recognized as a federal records annex in a city she'd never been to while officially existing. She picked it up and looked at it and put it back down. He's still alive, she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. He is, and he's been sitting on the original records for 3 years. He can't bring them forward without corroboration. The agency can't use his testimony without someone who can independently verify the operational timeline. Cross watched her. That's why I'm here. Not because of what happened in that trauma bay, although a small shift in his expression. That was, to be honest, not what I was expecting. I was a nurse. You were also something else. She was quiet for a moment. The old man near the window was done with his pie. He was sitting back looking out at the street with the satisfied expression of someone who had handled that correctly. Kane filed a restriction on my practice this morning, she said. Cross nodded. He knew. He's going to dig into my work history. If he finds inconsistencies, he's not going to find anything, Cross said. The documents that support your civilian record are solid. The gap is real. We couldn't fabricate employment without creating a different risk. But the reason you'd give for the gap is credible and provable to the level anyone's going to actually verify. He's already passed the level of anyone's going to actually verify. I know. Which is why I'm talking to you today instead of next week. Cross leaned forward slightly. Dr. Kane has been in contact with 2 individuals in the past 18 hours. One is a hospital administrator, The other is a former military records officer. Kane doesn't know this person's significance. He's just looking for ammunition. But the person he's talking to is the same person who manages the office that processed the Route 9 convoy authorization. Olivia went very still. Kane isn't part of this, Cross said. He doesn't know what he's touching. He's a doctor who's annoyed and looking for information to build a personnel case. But the person he's in contact with is going to know that Kane is asking questions about you. And that person is going to tell someone. He paused. You understand what I'm saying? The moment Kane gets a response from that records office, the people cleaning house know there's a nurse in Caldwell who's connected to Hargrove Regional who someone is asking about. Yes? The diner's background noise continued. The women at the counter had moved on to a different topic. Olivia set down her coffee cup. Her hands were steady. How long? Hours, maybe less. She breathed once, evenly. The disciplinary hearing, Kane will want it fast. He's that kind of man. He'll have it scheduled within the next 24 hours. My guess also. I need to be there. Cross looked at her. You want to attend a disciplinary hearing while I'm not going to run, she said. It came out flat, without drama, just a fact. I've been running for 6 years. I'm not doing it from a hospital where I just saved a man's life. A pause. And I'm not doing it because a doctor with a personnel file is the reason it starts. Cross sat back. He looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite admiration and landed somewhere in between, the specific expression of a person who had been doing a complicated job for a long time and occasionally ran into someone who made a variable he'd been trying to calculate simply resolve. The hearing, he said. I'll need 24 hours. For what? To get the documentation I need to walk into that room. She looked at him. You've had 3 years. I've had evidence. I haven't had corroboration. He put his card on the table beside her coffee cup. Plain white, DIA seal, a phone number. Give me 24 hours. Go to the hearing. Don't let Kane push you out before I get there. She picked up the card, looked at it, put it in her jacket pocket. He's going to try to get me to resign, she said. I know. I won't. I know. He stood. He was taller standing than she'd registered in the parking lot. He put a 20 on the table for the coffee, which was far more than 2 coffees cost. And he said, the convoy logs have the authorization cancellation embedded in the metadata. It's time-stamped. It's tied to a login credential. And the person who logged in that day retired in 2020 with a commendation. A pause. 3 other people died because of what that cancellation enabled. Their families were told it was a navigation error. Olivia said nothing. Your casualty file says non-recoverable, Cross said. That means someone decided officially that you weren't worth going back for. I think that's a record that should be corrected. He walked out. The bell above the door gave its small sound. Olivia sat in the booth until the waitress came by and she paid for the coffee, and then she sat for a few more minutes in the afternoon light that came through the front windows and lay in long rectangles on the linoleum floor. Her coffee was cold. She drank the rest of it anyway. Non-recoverable. She had read her own file once, 3 years ago, in a library in a city she'd been in for 6 weeks under a name that wasn't hers. She had read the notation and sat in the library chair for a long time the way she sometimes sat with things. Not processing exactly, more like allowing the true weight of them to be what it was, rather than managing it into something smaller. Non-recoverable meant someone had decided. It wasn't a finding, it was a choice. She got up, left the diner, and drove back toward the hospital. She didn't go inside. She sat in the parking lot for a while looking at the building. Its layers of architecture, its windows, its lit emergency entrance with the ambulances sitting in their bays. She'd only been here 14 months. That wasn't long in the life she'd built out of short spans of time and careful distances. But she thought about the woman with the panic attack, the one she'd sat with at 4 a.m. until her breathing came back, and the elderly man whose insulin she'd gotten right when 2 other people had gotten it wrong, and the 8-year-old with the asthma attack 2 weeks ago who had come in scared and gone home steady, and whose mother had squeezed Olivia's arm in the hallway afterward and said thank you, in a voice that didn't require any response because the weight of what she meant was fully contained in those 2 words. She thought about the timestamp on her nursing note. 11:58 p.m. 33 minutes before Damon Voss crashed, she got out of the car. She went through the front entrance, took the elevator to the third floor, and stood at the nurse's station until Garrett looked up. "I need to know if a disciplinary hearing has been scheduled," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He typed something. "Tomorrow morning," he said. 9 o'clock. "Which room?" He told her. She nodded. "Thank you." She was back in the elevator when her personal phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. "Kane pulled your military auxiliary records from the DoD public database. He has a name. Not your current name. An old one." She looked at the message for the full duration of the elevator ride. The doors opened on the lobby. She stepped out into the hum and movement of the hospital's public space, among the people coming and going with their ordinary burdens and their ordinary needs. And she stood there for a moment among all of it, alone in the specific way she had been alone for 6 years. And she thought, tomorrow, 9 o'clock. And then she thought about Cross, and the convoy logs, and the name on the photograph, and what 24 hours actually meant. And then she went home to wait. She didn't sleep. She tried, in the way she'd learned to try, flat on her back, controlled breathing, inventory of physical sensations taken and cataloged and set aside. But the apartment had a different quality to it tonight. The way spaces sometimes changed when you'd made a decision in them and then had to wait out the hours between the decision and its consequence. She lay in the dark until 2 in the morning and then got up, made tea she didn't particularly want, and sat at the kitchen table with the prepaid phone face down in front of her. Kane had a name. Not her current name. An old one. The old name was Olivia Mercer. It was the name on her original military enlistment, on her deployment paperwork, on the casualty file that read non-recoverable. It was the name she had left behind the way you left behind something that had been damaged past the point of continued use. Not with ceremony, just with the practical acknowledgement that it no longer served. She had been Hayes for 4 years. Hayes was a solid identity, built carefully, with the kind of depth that casual verification didn't penetrate. But Kane wasn't doing casual verification anymore. He had a name, and he had a records contact, and he had the particular motivated energy of someone who had decided this was a problem he was going to solve. What he didn't know was what that name connected to. She turned the prepaid phone over and looked at it. No new messages. Cross had said 24 hours. It was now hour 14. She thought about the photograph he'd put on the table, the man outside the Federal Records Annex. She had not let herself think about him directly in 3 years, had kept him in the peripheral category of things that were true but not useful to examine, because thinking about him directly meant thinking about the specific sequence of events that had led to a 17-minute window when 7 people were in the field and someone decided the authorization wasn't worth honoring. She knew his name. She had known it since 2 months after she'd gotten out, when she'd spent 6 days in a library, in a different state, with access to enough public records to reconstruct the basic shape of what had happened. She had never contacted him. She had stayed out of his radius because staying out of everyone's radius was the operating principle, and because she had not known what she would say. "Thank you for protecting my file, and 3 other people died because of what that office did," were not sentences that fit easily in the same conversation. At 4 a.m., she gave up on the pretense of the night and showered, dressed, made real coffee. She reviewed the nursing documentation from Voss's intake one more time on the hospital portal, which still showed her access as active. She noted that Kane had added an addendum to the Trauma Bay record, brief, dry, characterizing her intervention as unauthorized, and that Webb had signed off on it, which she had expected and which still landed with a small, specific weight. Webb was 26 and wanted to match at a good program next year, and was not going to put his name on the wrong side of the attending who ran his evaluations. She logged out of the portal and made a second coffee she didn't finish. At 7 a.m., she called Sandra. "You're awake," Sandra said, which meant Sandra hadn't slept either. "What's the room situation for the hearing?" "Conference B, on the administrative floor. Victor's bringing the department chief, that's Dr. Renata Marsh, and HR is sending a formal rep." A pause. "Olivia, he found something." She kept her voice even. "What did he find?" "I don't know the specifics, but he came in at 6 this morning, which Victor never does, and he went straight to Marsh's office and they were in there for 40 minutes. When he came out, he looked..." Sandra hesitated. Satisfied. He looked satisfied. Okay? That's all you have? Okay? I'll be there at 9, Olivia said. Is Voss cleared for any activity? A longer pause. Why? Is he? He's 1 day post-op from a splenic repair. His activity clearance is bathroom privileges with assistance. Olivia, what are you— I'll be there at 9, she said again, and ended the call. She left the apartment at 8, drove to the hospital, and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes. The morning was overcast, the sky the flat gray of a city that couldn't decide between rain and simply withholding sun. And the parking lot had the ordinary activity of a Tuesday morning. Shift changes, visitors arriving, a delivery truck at the service entrance. Nothing unusual. No dark SUV. At 8:51, she went inside. Conference B was a room she'd never had reason to enter before. Administrative floor, wood veneer table, a credenza along one wall with a coffee service nobody had touched, windows facing the parking structure. Dr. Renata Marsh was already there when Olivia arrived, which was a choice. Arriving early to establish the room as yours was a specific kind of positioning. Marsh was in her 60s, with the compact authority of someone who had been managing institutional complexity for a long time, and had developed, as a result, a certain quality of stillness that was not calm exactly, but was controlled. She nodded at Olivia without warmth, but also without hostility. The HR representative, a man named Fielding, who had the exhausted neutrality of someone whose entire job was navigating these rooms, sat to Marsh's left with a folder in front of him. Kane came in 2 minutes later. He had dressed carefully for this, which told her everything about his read of the room, not the casual authority of his usual scrubs and coat combination, but a suit jacket, pressed, the specific outfit of a man who wanted to be legible as a figure of institutional standing rather than just a physician. He looked at Olivia sitting at the table, and something moved across his face that was too fast to name. Ms. Hayes, Marsh said, thank you for coming. I want to be clear that the purpose of this meeting is to review the events of the night shift on the 14th, specifically regarding the incidents in Trauma Bay 1. This is not a termination hearing. It is a formal review with the potential for disciplinary action. I understand, Olivia said. Kane set a folder on the table with a deliberateness that was close enough to theatrical that Marsh gave him a brief look. He didn't notice, or didn't care. I want to go on record, he said, that my concerns about Ms. Hayes' conduct in this trauma bay are distinct from a separate matter I've brought to Dr. Marsh's attention this morning. The conduct review and the background concern are related, but I want them documented separately. Marsh looked at him. Dr. Kane, I'd prefer we proceed in order. The order matters. He opened the folder. On the night of the 14th, Ms. Hayes made unauthorized physical contact with a combative patient, deactivated overhead lighting without physician authorization, contradicted my clinical assessment in front of trainees, and conducted what amounted to an unsupervised resuscitation in a trauma bay. I called the rhythm, Olivia said. I coordinated the medications. The resuscitation took 3 minutes and 19 seconds and resulted in ROSC. The patient is in the surgical ICU stable. That is not the question of whether the actions were within your scope. The question of scope in a cardiac arrest is whether the patient survives. He did. Kane's jaw tightened by a fraction. The question of scope is exactly, Dr. Kane, Marsh's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Let her finish. Olivia kept her voice at the same register it had been. Not deferential, not combative, the register of someone presenting documentation. My nursing notes from 11:58 p.m. record abdominal rigidity, inconsistent with the presenting shoulder wound. That assessment was made 33 minutes before the patient's hemodynamic deterioration. The note is time-stamped and in the chart. Dr. Kane's addendum, added post-recovery, characterizes my intervention as unauthorized. He is correct that I acted without explicit physician direction. He is also correct that the patient would not have survived if I had waited for it. Fielding was writing something. The background matter, Kane said, is germane to this discussion because it speaks to Ms. Hayes' credibility and to what she may or may not have represented to this hospital at the time of hire. He pulled a paper from the folder. Ms. Hayes' employment file contains a 17-month gap. During that gap, I have found a military auxiliary registration under a different name. Olivia Mercer, which does not match any subsequent employment, medical, or administrative record. The name Mercer appears in connection with a military personnel file that is marked restricted, and I have been advised by a Department of Defense records contact that the file contains a casualty notation. The room was quiet. "I am not," Kane said, suggesting that Ms. Hayes is not who she says she is in terms of her nursing credential, which appears to be legitimately held. "I am suggesting that there is a significant and unaddressed discrepancy in her represented identity and background, and that this institution may have hired someone whose history it does not fully understand." Marsh looked at Olivia. Her expression was careful, which was not the same as hostile, but it was not a look that contained any of the morning's goodwill either. "Ms. Hayes," she said, "is there something you'd like to address?" Olivia was looking at the window behind Marsh. The parking structure's third level was visible through the glass. She was thinking about Cross. Hour 20, approximately. She was thinking about 24 hours and what it meant in practical terms. What had to be assembled, transported, presented. She was thinking about a man outside a federal records annex whose name she had known for 3 years. She was also thinking about the fact that Kane had contacted a DOD records officer, and Cross had said the moment that contact happened, the people cleaning house would know there was a nurse in Caldwell being inquired about, which meant right now, in an office somewhere that was not this room, someone was looking at a query and recognizing a name. "Ms. Hayes," Marsh's voice again. "I'm thinking about how to answer," Olivia said. Kane made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's..." The door opened. Not a knock, not a pause. It opened with the specific directness of someone who had already decided they were coming in and was doing so as a courtesy to the room rather than a request of it. The man who entered was in uniform, army dress greens, colonel's insignia, the kind of bearing that arrived ahead of a person like a change in air pressure. Behind him was a younger officer carrying a black document case. And behind her, in the doorway, was Damon Voss in a hospital gown and a robe that didn't quite close over his shoulder dressing, moving slowly with his left arm immobilized, his face the color of a man who had been talked out of his SICU bed by an argument rather than medical clearance, and was paying for it in real time, but had decided the cost was acceptable. Colonel Ethan Cross looked at the room, looked at Kane, looked at Marsh, and said, "I apologize for the interruption. I'll need 5 minutes." Marsh stared at him. "This is a closed personnel review." "Yes, ma'am. I'm aware of what it is." He set his credentials on the table in front of her. "And I understand the interruption, but what I have is directly relevant to the matters being discussed in this room, and I've been in contact with your hospital's legal office since 6:30 this morning. They've been advised that I would be coming." Marsh looked at the credentials. She looked at Fielding, who was looking at the credentials with the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of what kind of Tuesday this was. She looked at Cross. "Sit down," she said. Cross pulled out the chair across from Kane. The junior officer set the document case on the table. Voss stayed standing near the door because sitting down would have required his body to do something it was currently not enthusiastic about, and he braced himself against the door frame with his right hand and breathed at a measured rate and looked at no one in particular while clearly tracking everything. "Dr. Kane," Cross said, "has contacted a former military records officer named Dale Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard currently manages a records processing unit connected to a logistics coordination office. Dr. Kane believed he was requesting background verification on a civilian nurse. He was not incorrect about that. What he was not aware of is that Mr. Pritchard's unit is currently under federal review for the unauthorized alteration of military transport authorizations and casualty records spanning a period from 2016 to 2021. Kane's folder was still open on the table. He hadn't closed it. "When Dr. Kane contacted Mr. Pritchard's office yesterday," Cross continued, "that contact was flagged by our monitoring protocols. Mr. Pritchard, upon receiving the inquiry, made 2 phone calls. The first was to Dr. Kane. The second was to an individual who is named in the federal review as a subject." A pause that was measured to the second. "Mr. Pritchard was detained this morning at 7:14 a.m. The credenza coffee service sat untouched on the far wall. Somewhere in the building, a phone was ringing in someone else's problem and being answered. Kane said, "I don't understand what any of this..." "The name Olivia Mercer," Cross said, appears in a military casualty file that was altered on 2 separate occasions after the date of the original entry. The original entry, dated April 19, 2018, recorded a classified field operation casualty. The file was subsequently amended twice, once in September 2018 and once in March 2019. The amendments changed the casualty classification. The individual making those amendments used access credentials belonging to a logistics coordination officer. He opened the document case and removed a set of pages, which he placed on the table in front of Marsh with the careful flatness of someone who understood the weight of paper. What those amendments actually did was protect the identity and location of a surviving member of that operation. The original casualty notation was a deliberate misdirection created by a colleague to ensure that certain people could not track the surviving individual through official channels. Marsh was looking at the documents. She was not a demonstrative person. Olivia had read that in the first 2 minutes, but her reading posture had changed, tightened into something more focused. The surviving individual, Cross said, is Olivia Hayes, formerly Olivia Mercer, combat medic, classified special operations support, 4 deployments, 2 commendations, and a tactical medical record that, and I will say this for the benefit of everyone in this room, is significantly more extensive than what a nursing credential would typically represent. He looked at Kane for exactly 1 second. She did not misrepresent her qualifications to this institution. She underrepresented them. Kane was very still. Voss spoke from the doorway. His voice was rougher than it had been yesterday. The post-surgical rasp of someone who was running on less than his system needed, but it was level. She saved my life 3 times in one night, he said. Once in the bay, once when she flagged the internal bleed, and once during the arrest. I'll submit that formally, in writing, in whatever format this institution requires. Marsh set down the documents. She looked at Olivia. Olivia looked back at her. She had not moved from her chair throughout any of this. Her hands were on this table, flat, still. She was aware of her own heartbeat in the way she was aware of everything, accurately, without letting it run anything. Ms. Hayes, Marsh said, and her voice had shifted into a different register than it had been using before. The register of someone who was doing a rapid institutional recalculation and was professional enough to do it without visible scrambling. I think we need to... Kane's phone went off. He looked at the screen. His face did something she'd never seen it do in 14 months. It went uncertain. Not just surprised. Uncertain in the specific way of someone who has just received information that restructures the room they thought they were in. He looked up. He looked at Cross. And in the silence of that look, she could see him understanding for the first time exactly what he had started when he'd picked up the phone to call Dale Pritchard's office. Cross's expression was patient and gave nothing. Kane looked at Olivia. She said nothing. She didn't need to. His phone went off a second time. Kane's phone went off a third time. He didn't answer it. He was looking at the screen with the expression of a man reading something in a language he'd been confident he understood until this exact moment, and the text was doing something the language wasn't supposed to do. His hand, holding the phone, dropped to the table slowly, the way heavy things settled rather than fell. Cross watched him without expression. The junior officer beside him had not moved or changed her posture since sitting down. Voss was still at the doorframe, still breathing at his measured rate, still tracking the room with the eyes of a man who had been trained to stay present in situations that made most people's attention collapse inward. Marsh said, "Dr. Kane, would you like to take that call outside?" It was not really a question. It was a room being managed by someone who understood that the shape of this meeting had just changed completely and was adjusting the infrastructure accordingly. Kane stood. He was careful about it, slow, deliberate, the physical expression of a man who was not going to let his body show what his mind was doing. He picked up his folder. He looked at Olivia one more time, and she held his gaze without giving him anything, because there was nothing she owed him in this moment, and she'd stopped performing things she didn't owe a long time ago. He left the room. Marsh looked at Cross. "Colonel, what exactly is the federal exposure here for the hospital?" "Hargrove Regional has no federal exposure," Cross said. "The hospital hired a fully credentialed nurse whose documentation is legitimate." "What doctor?" Kane did subsequently, contacting a records office in connection with a civilian employee's background vet. "Is a personnel matter with potential HR implications. not a legal one for the institution. A pause. Unless the hospital takes adverse action against Ms. Hayes based on the information Kane obtained, which would create a different set of questions. But I expect that won't be the direction things go from here. Marsh looked at the documents in front of her for a moment. Then she looked at Olivia. The restriction Dr. Kane filed this morning, that's suspended pending review, effective now. Fielding wrote something in his folder. His expression suggested he was going to need a significantly longer lunch than usual. The performance review, Marsh said, is also suspended. She picked up one of the documents Cross had placed in front of her, looked at it, set it down with the care of someone handling something that was going to need to be processed fully later, in private, with adequate time. I want to be honest with you, Ms. Hayes. I've been running this department for 9 years. I've sat in a lot of rooms like this one. I've never had one change directions like this. I understand, Olivia said. I don't mean that as a complaint. Marsh's voice had shed some of its formal layer. Not warm, exactly, but less constructed. I mean it as an acknowledgement. Whatever happens next, with the federal matter, with the questions about your background, I want you to know that what I just heard about what happened in that trauma bay is the kind of thing we spend a lot of institutional energy trying to produce and very rarely actually see. She stopped. That's all. The meeting is adjourned. Cross was already closing the document case. Olivia stood, pushed in her chair, and moved toward the door where Voss was still standing, because she was reasonably concerned that Voss had been upright for as long as his post-operative body was currently willing to support. You need to go back, she said to him quietly. Not a suggestion. I know. He looked at her. Up close, in the conference room's flat light, she could see the specific pallor of someone spending physical reserves they weren't supposed to be spending yet. His right hand on the doorframe had gone from bracing to something closer to necessary. Wanted to see it. You saw it. Yeah. Something moved in his expression that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The expression of a man who had wanted a specific thing to happen and had watched it happen and was now going to let his body make its argument about returning to bed. Yeah, I did. She walked with him back to the elevator because nobody else in that room was going to, and because his body language was telling her he was 3 minutes from needing to sit down, regardless of what was around him when that happened. The junior officer materialized smoothly to his other side without being asked, which Olivia noted with the appreciation of someone who recognized competent instinct. They rode up to the 3rd floor in a silence that didn't require filling, and when the doors opened and Garrett saw Voss in the hallway, the charge nurse's expression ran through approximately 4 emotions in 2 seconds before settling on the functional one. Get him back, Olivia said to Garrett, working on it. Garrett was already there, already redirecting Voss toward his room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with patients who believed their own resilience was unlimited and had been proven wrong about it at inconvenient times. I know he didn't get out of that bed on his own authority, Garrett said, not looking at Olivia. He had reasons. He always does, that type. But there was no real sharpness in it. She watched them go down the hall, then she turned and walked back toward the elevator. Cross was waiting near the elevator bank. The junior officer, he'd introduced her as Lieutenant Sosa during the meeting, a name and rank that had registered and filed, had gone to wherever junior officers went when they were waiting on a colonel's next move. Cross had his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of someone who had finished one task and had not yet fully loaded the weight of the next. That went faster than I expected, he said. Kane's phone, Olivia said. What was on it? The notification we sent to the hospital's legal office copied him directly. Standard practice in situations involving personnel and active federal review. He was informed that contacting Pritchard's office was going to be material to the federal case, and that any further contact would constitute potential interference. Cross looked at the elevator doors. He'd also been told separately that Pritchard had been detained. That second notification came from Pritchard's supervisor, who was covering themselves. So he knew the ground had moved before he walked into that room. He knew something had moved. He walked in anyway because he'd committed to the direction and didn't have an exit that wouldn't look like retreat. Cross paused. That's a particular failure mode in people who are used to their institutions protecting them. They stay in the motion even when the motion is wrong because stopping requires an admission they don't know how to make. She looked at him. You've been thinking about Kane. I've been thinking about the category. It's a useful one. The elevator arrived. He held it. We need to talk about what comes next. Not here. You said Pritchard was detained this morning, but Pritchard is a middle link, the subject of the federal review, the individual who issued and then canceled the rescue authorization in 2018, is someone with more layers between himself and the paper trail. Pritchard made 2 phone calls yesterday. The second one, to the review subject, was the problem, because now that subject knows there's an active federal inquiry touching names connected to the 2018 operation, and he knows one of those names is in Caldwell. The elevator held its doors with mechanical patience. He's going to move, Olivia said. He may already be moving. Cross stepped into the elevator. There's a federal building 2 miles from here. I'd like to finish this conversation there. She looked at the elevator, looked at the hallway, looked at the administrative floor indicator above the elevator bank. Somewhere on that floor, Victor Kane was on his phone, having a conversation that was going to define what the next months of his professional life looked like, and she was standing here deciding whether to get in an elevator. She got in the elevator. The federal building was a 10-story block of government architecture from the 1980s that had the energy of a place that processed a lot of paper with minimal ceremony. Cross had a temporary office on the 7th floor, a room with a window, a table, and the document case that Sosa had apparently transported there while they were in the elevator, which meant Sosa moved fast and knew exactly what she was doing. Cross put a file on the table in front of Olivia. Not the documents he'd brought to the hearing, different ones, more of them, organized with the color tabs of someone who lived in documentation. Martin Greer, he said. She looked at the name at the top of the first page. The photograph beside it showed a man in his early 60s, the kind of face that read as forgettable in a specific, deliberate way. Soft features, average coloring, the presentation of a person who had learned that the best protective coloration was ordinariness. She had seen his name in the public records she'd assembled 3 years ago. She'd gotten close to him and stopped herself because getting close without a structure around her was the kind of move that got people hurt. Former Deputy Logistics Coordinator, DIA, Cross said, retired 2020, currently a defense contracting consultant in Baltimore. He's been operating inside the review's scope for 8 months, but we've had a documentation problem. The primary evidence, the authorization and its cancellation, exists as metadata embedded in a logistics routing system that Greer has standing access to through his contracting relationships. Every time we've gotten near a formal request to pull that data, the system has logged a maintenance window that clears the relevant transaction record. He's been deleting it, editing it. Small changes that individually look like clerical corrections but cumulatively reassemble the record into something that doesn't implicate him. Cross sat down across from her. Pritchard's arrest changes his calculus. He's going to know that Pritchard was his most direct exposure. He's going to assume Pritchard is talking. Is he? Pritchard hasn't said anything useful yet. He's lawyering up, which is what people in his position do, and that process takes time we may not have. Cross opened the file to a specific page. What Greer doesn't know is that the original system logs from 2018, from the night the authorization was canceled, were archived offline by a protocol that was discontinued in 2019. He's been editing the live system for 3 years. The archived version is intact. We have it. What we need is someone who can look at the original authorization record and confirm what it describes, because the technical metadata alone is... He stopped. It tells us the what. We need the who and the operational context. We need someone who was in that field position on April 19th, 2018, and can say what that authorization would have meant to the team on the ground. Olivia looked at the file page. It was a technical log printout, lines of time-stamped data, and halfway down the page she could see the entry she knew was there without having seen it before. The way you sometimes recognized a shape before you'd consciously identified it. April 19th, 2018, 23:41. 07. AU cancels test set. Routing coord, Greer, M. Re-FCS, oplog 7-alpha-19. 7 alpha, she said. That was the operation's log designation. She looked at the timestamp, 23:41, 11:41 at night. She had been in a specific location at that specific time, and she knew exactly what the authorization cancellation had meant, because she'd been waiting for the extraction window, and it had not opened. And she had watched, over the following 4 hours, what happened to people when the window didn't open. 3 people died in those 4 hours, she said. Yes. The other 3 got out separately. 2 extraction windows the following morning, unofficial channels. We know. The channels were managed by a logistics NCO who was using personal contacts because the official route was closed. She paused. That NCO. Is the individual in the photograph I showed you in the diner, Cross said. He's been sitting on the original op logs and his own records for 3 years because he knew the moment he surfaced them, Greer would know where they came from. What changed? Pritchard changed it. The moment Pritchard was detained, Greer's first move was to access the logistics system and attempt another edit. Our monitoring caught it. We froze his access, which he's now aware of, which means he knows we have the archived logs. Which means the NCO's protection is gone. Greer already knows someone kept the records. The question now is whether we move faster than Greer does. Olivia looked at the file. The timestamp sat there, plain and bureaucratic, the way the most important things sometimes presented themselves, in the most unremarkable possible format. I'll testify, she said. Cross looked at her steadily. This goes federal. The testimony would be official record, public filing. I know what federal means. Your identity, your history, becomes documentable. I know. She looked up from the file. The people who needed to not find me were always eventually going to find me. That's how these things run. The question was always whether I got to be part of what happened when they did. A pause. I'd rather be part of it. Cross held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him recalculating something, the same small recalibration she'd seen in the parking lot when she'd said, I'm not going to run. He had, she suspected, spent months building a case around the possibility of her cooperation and had not been entirely confident about it until approximately right now. There's a deposition process, he said. Formal, documented. It starts today if you're willing. Let's start. It took 4 hours. Sosa ran the recording equipment. A federal attorney named Adler, who had the quick, economical manner of someone who asked exactly the question she wanted the answer to, and nothing else, joined them at the table. And Olivia sat in the government chair under the flat government light and answered questions about April 2018 with the specificity of someone who had spent 6 years not being able to tell this story and had retained every detail in the airless internal storage of things you couldn't let go of because there was nowhere to put them. She described the authorization window, the timing, the extraction point, and the 7-person team and the precise sequence of events after the window failed to open. She described what she'd done in the following 4 hours, the decisions made, the resources available, the outcomes. She described the unofficial extraction, the channels, the NCO who'd managed them. She described what she'd found out later, the slow reconstruction of 2 years spent in the margins of official existence, and the shape of what the record showed versus what had actually happened. Adler asked precise questions. Olivia gave precise answers. She didn't editorialize, and she didn't perform emotion, and she didn't pause in the places that would have made the story land differently, because this was not about landing. This was about the record. When it was done, she signed the deposition form and drank the first water she'd been offered, which she'd been too focused to touch for 4 hours. That's enough for today, Adler said. We'll need a second session for the technical record review. Tomorrow, Cross said. He was looking at his phone. His expression had changed slightly. Not alarmed, but more active. The expression of someone whose attention had shifted from the room he was in to something happening outside it. What? Olivia said. Greer filed a travel notification at Baltimore-Washington Airport 40 minutes ago. He looked up. He's moving. The room recalibrated around that information. Sosa was already on her phone. Adler had closed her notepad and was typing. He can't run from a federal review, Olivia said. He's not running. He's going somewhere specific. Cross stood. He has a second residence in Caldwell, has had it for 5 years. We didn't flag it as significant until... He's coming here, she said. His contractor relationship here is with a defense logistics firm 2 miles from the hospital. A pause that had weight in it. The firm processes records transfers for 3 different military archives, including the archive that holds the offline log backup we froze this morning. She understood. He thinks he can access the backup through the contractor network. He thinks the freeze only covered his direct credentials. He has a proxy access through the contractor relationship that we didn't pull because we didn't know about it until 40 minutes ago. Do you know about it now? We're working on it. Cross was already at the door. If he gets to that system through the contractor, he can delete the archived logs. Yes, the 3 years that record had been sitting in an offline archive. The timestamp that said April 19th, 2018, 23:41:07. The 4 hours she'd spent in a field position in the dark, waiting for an extraction window that Martin Greer had closed with a single keystroke and then spent 3 years editing out of existence. How long does he have? She said. He lands in 2 hours. The contractor office is 15 minutes from the airport. Cross looked at her. We're moving on the proxy access now. But these things have complications, she said. Yes. She stood up. Her legs were fine. Her head was clear in the specific way it went clear when the variables simplified into a single sequence of required actions. What do you need from me? Nothing right now. This is a federal operation. Cross. She said it flatly, without apology. What do you need? He looked at her for a moment. She could see him doing the calculation of what she was and what he was, and what the procedural rules said, and what the situation actually required. The calculation that competent people in institutional structures sometimes had to do when the institution's pace and the situation's pace were running at different speeds. The contractor office, he said. The access point is a physical terminal in the records room. If Greer gets there before we pull his proxy credentials, someone needs to be in that building. I can be in that building. You're a civilian. I'm also the person whose testimony just spent 4 hours documenting what those logs contain. If they disappear, she didn't finish it because he already knew what it meant. If the archived logs disappeared, the deposition was corroborated testimony without primary documentary evidence. Usable, but weakened. The kind of weakened that defense attorneys who worked for people like Martin Greer were very skilled at exploiting. Cross looked at Sosa. Something passed between them that was faster than speech. You don't touch anything, he said to Olivia. You don't interact with anyone, you don't represent yourself as federal, and the moment our team arrives, you step back. Understood. I mean it. I said understood. He held her gaze for exactly long enough to confirm he believed her. Then he told her the address. What? The contractor office occupied the ground floor of a building that had been an insurance company for 20 years and still had the ghost of that function in its carpeting and its ceiling tiles and the particular quality of its fluorescent lighting. The records room was at the back, behind a corridor and a badge access door that was propped open with a fire extinguisher because someone had been going in and out frequently and had gotten tired of badging. Olivia noted the propped door the way she noted everything, walked past it, and found a position in the corridor that gave her sightlines to both the records room entrance and the building's rear exit. She had been there 11 minutes when the rear door opened. Martin Greer in person was exactly what the photograph had prepared her for. Ordinary, soft-featured, moving with the careful, unhurried manner of a man who had been unremarkable in his personal presentation for his entire professional life as a deliberate strategy. He was in a suit that was slightly wrong for travel, the kind of suit a man put on when he wanted to look like he had a legitimate reason to be somewhere. He had a bag over one shoulder and a key card in his hand that he hadn't been issued by this company's front desk. He walked toward the records room. He was 4 feet from the door when he saw her. She was standing in the corridor, facing him, not blocking him exactly, just present in the space in a way that stopped him the way a person stops when they encounter an unexpected element and their brain spends half a second deciding what category to put it in. He looked at her. She looked at him. The records room is restricted, he said. His voice was neutral, practiced. The voice of a man who managed information for a living and had learned to deliver all of it at the same temperature. I know, she said. He looked at her more carefully. Something moved behind his eyes. The recalculation of what her presence here meant, running fast through its iterations. She could see him landing on the conclusion that someone had gotten here first, and he was making a decision about what to do with that. I don't think we've met, he said. No, she said. But I know what you did on April 19th, 2018 at 2341, and I just spent 4 hours on the record saying so. The building was quiet around them. The prop door at the end of the corridor let in the low ambient sound of the afternoon outside. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang twice and was answered. Greer's face did something that was almost nothing, the smallest shift in the muscles around his eyes, the nearly imperceptible tightening of someone who has just heard something that ends a particular kind of hoping. And then it was still again. "I want to call my attorney," he said. "That's your right," she said. His hand went to his pocket for his phone, and at that same moment, the building's rear door opened again, and Sosa came in with 2 federal agents and the specific atmosphere of people who had been moving fast and had arrived where they intended to be. Greer turned, looked at them, looked back at Olivia. "Olivia Mercer," he said. It was almost quiet. The voice of a man identifying a variable that had been missing from his model for 6 years and understanding now all the things that variable's absence had allowed him to believe were still manageable. "Hayes," she said, "my name is Olivia Hayes." Sosa reached Greer and began the quiet procedural language of a federal detention, and Olivia stepped back against the corridor wall to give them the space to do their work. And she watched Greer's face while Sosa talked, watched the specific dissolution of a face that had spent years managing information and had just run out of ways to manage this particular piece of it. He was still looking at her when Sosa turned him toward the rear exit. She stayed in the corridor after they left. The prop door swung slightly in the draft from outside. The fire extinguisher held it open. The records room was dark, the terminal inside still locked, the archived log with its 2018 timestamp intact on a server that Martin Greer had spent 3 years trying to reach. Her phone buzzed. Cross. "Got him. Good work." She put the phone away. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She stood in the corridor of a former insurance company building on a Tuesday afternoon in Caldwell and let the specific weight of the last 24 hours settle through her without trying to sort it yet, because some things needed to be felt in their actual dimensions before you tried to put them anywhere. 3 people who had died on a field position in 2018 had names. Their families had been told it was a navigation error. The log still existed. She had just testified to what it meant. She pushed off the wall, walked to the rear exit, and went out into the afternoon. Her phone buzzed again. Different number. "Sandra Pruitt. Victor Kane's been placed on administrative leave. Dr. Marsh just announced it. The whole floor knows." She looked at the message. Read it twice. Then a second text from Sandra, 40 seconds after the first. "There's something else. HR just pulled his personnel file on your orders. Not yours. They're saying it came from legal. And what they found in Kane's own file..." The message stopped there. No follow-up. Like Sandra had been interrupted mid-sentence, or had decided that what she was about to say was something that needed a phone call rather than a text. Olivia stood on the sidewalk outside the contractor building and called her back. Sandra picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been holding the phone. "What's in his file?" Olivia said. Sandra was quiet for exactly 1 second. "He has a prior," Sandra said. "Not a criminal record, a professional one. From a hospital in Michigan 9 years ago, a nurse filed a formal complaint, unauthorized alteration of a clinical record. The record involved a patient outcome Kane had mismanaged. The complaint was settled quietly. Kane left Michigan. The settlement included a non-disclosure." A pause. "Legal found it because it was in a database they specifically searched when Cross's team flagged Kane's contact with the Federal Records Office. They were looking for a pattern." Olivia let that sit for a moment. "He altered a clinical record," she said, 9 years ago. "And the reason it matters now..." Sandra stopped again, and Olivia could hear her deciding whether to say the next part. "The addendum he filed to Voss's Trauma Bay record. The one characterizing your intervention as unauthorized. Legal wants to know if that addendum accurately reflects what happened, or whether it was..." "It wasn't," Olivia said. "That's what I thought." Sandra's voice had gone quieter. "Olivia, this is bigger than a personnel review." "I know. Legal is talking to the medical board. If they find that he filed a false clinical addendum to a patient record, that's not an HR matter anymore. That's a licensing matter." Olivia looked at the building across the street, which was a parking structure, which had nothing to tell her. She looked at the sky, which was still the flat gray of the morning, unchanged by the afternoon's events, indifferent to the specific mechanics of human consequence playing out beneath it. Victor Kane, who had called her wallpaper, who had told her he had this every time she'd tried to give him something that would have changed the outcome, who had filed paperwork at 4 a.m. before his patient was out of the operating room, who had 9 years ago in a hospital in Michigan already done a version of this to someone else. "Tell legal I'll cooperate with whatever review they need," she said. "I will." Sandra paused. "There's one more thing. Voss has been asking for you. The nursing staff says he won't stop until someone tells him what happened today." Despite everything, something shifted in her face that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "I'll go see him." "Olivia." Sandra's voice had dropped to something that wasn't her professional register at all. "I'm sorry for not moving faster on his restriction request. I should have." "You did what you could within what you had," Olivia said. "That's what we all do." She ended the call and put her phone in her pocket and started walking toward where she'd parked her car. The afternoon was gray and the city was doing what cities did, which was continue regardless of what any individual thing within it had just resolved or fallen apart. And she walked through it thinking about clinical record addenda and Michigan settlements and the specific way institutions protected their own, until protecting their own became more expensive than the alternative. And she thought about the timestamp at 23:41 on a night in 2018 when someone had decided 7 people weren't worth the extraction window. And she thought about the log sitting intact on a server in a building behind her. She was almost at her car when the text came through. Not from Sandra, not from Cross, not from a number she recognized. A number she'd never seen, local Caldwell area code. You should know the NDA from Michigan wasn't the only one. There were 3 settlements, different hospitals, different states. Legal only found 1. She stopped walking, read the message again, looked up at the street, the ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a bus pulling away from a stop half a block away, a woman walking a small dog who was deeply interested in a patch of sidewalk that contained information invisible to everyone else. 3 settlements, different hospitals. She got in her car. Her hands were steady on the wheel. She sat for a moment looking at the windshield. Somewhere in Hargrove Regional Medical Center, in whatever file cabinet or digital archive held the records of Victor Kane's 9 years of employment at this institution, there were patients whose charts had been through his hands and whose outcomes he had managed and whose records he had, potentially, provably, for a pattern that was starting to have a shape, adjusted to protect himself from what he'd gotten wrong. She pulled out of the parking space and drove toward the hospital. The drive back to Hargrove Regional took 9 minutes. She used 7 of them thinking and 2 of them parking. And by the time she walked through the front entrance, she had a clear enough shape of what needed to happen next that the thinking part was mostly done. The hospital felt different. That was not something she would have said out loud, because institutions didn't actually change their atmospheric texture based on personnel decisions, but there was something in the movement of people through the lobby that had a different quality than the morning. A slightly higher rate of eye contact between staff members. The particular cluster of 2 nurses near the information desk who weren't looking at their phones. The way the security guard at the front desk was sitting fractionally more upright than his usual posture. News moved through hospitals the way it moved through any closed system, fast, incomplete, and with a certainty that exceeded its accuracy. She went to the 3rd floor. Voss was sitting up in his bed when she came in, which was more vertical than he'd been in the parking structure hallway and was probably still more vertical than his surgical team had authorized. He had the television off, which told her something, and a paper cup of water on the tray table that he'd been working through, and the expression of a man who had been running calculations in a hospital bed for the last 4 hours, because lying still was a cognitive impossibility for him regardless of what his body required. "Greer," he said when she pulled the chair over. "Detained," she said. "Federal." His proxy access was pulled before he reached the terminal. Something moved through his face. Not relief exactly, more like the specific release of a tension that had been structural, the kind you didn't notice until it was gone. The logs. "Intact," he breathed. "And Kane." "Administrative leave. The medical board is being notified." She paused. "There are potentially 3 record settlements from previous institutions. Legal is working on it." Voss looked at the window, the parking structure again, the flat gray sky. 3, he said. Not a question. The voice of someone putting a number next to a category of behavior and understanding what that number meant about the people his system was supposed to protect. They'll find what they find, she said. Yeah. He turned back to her. You doing okay? The question landed simply, without performance, the way direct people ask direct questions when they actually wanted the answer. She looked at him for a moment. I'm doing, she said. That's an answer. It's the accurate one. He almost smiled. Fair enough. He shifted slightly and the wince was brief and controlled. The face of someone managing pain with the economy of a person who had been managing pain for a long time and had gotten efficient at it. The deposition. It's done. Adler will schedule a second session for the technical record review, but the primary testimony is on file. And the families. He said it quietly. The 3 people from the 2018 operation. She'd been waiting for this, in the way you waited for a weight you'd agreed to carry to be fully placed. Their records will be amended. Cross said the casualty corrections process starts once the federal filing is complete. The families will be formally notified. She stopped. It won't be fast. It won't, he agreed, but it'll happen. She nodded. They were quiet for a moment in the way 2 people were quiet when they'd been through something adjacent to the same thing from different angles and had arrived, temporarily, at the same place. The monitors ran their rhythms. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed. A real laugh, short and surprised, the kind that happened when something was genuinely funny and nobody was performing for it. I've been in the Army for 12 years, Voss said. I've seen a lot of people do the right thing when it was easy, and a couple of people do it when it wasn't. He looked at her steadily. You're the second kind. The rarer one. She held his gaze. So are you. I drove my spleen to a conference room. Yes, she said. You did. This time he actually smiled, and it changed his face entirely, the way smiles sometimes did in people who didn't use them as social currency, who deployed them rarely enough that when they appeared they meant something specific. She noted it the way she noted everything, accurately, without attaching more to it than it was, and found that the noticing had some warmth in it she didn't try to manage. Get some rest, she said. She stood. Your surgical team is going to have opinions about today. They've already shared them. I'd listen. Working on it. He looked up at her. Hayes. She stopped. Whatever they offer you next, after all this, make sure it's something you actually want, not just something that's owed. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the paper cup from his tray table because it was empty and in the way, and put it in the bin by the door, and left without answering because the answer needed more time than she currently had. And he knew that, and that was part of why it was worth hearing. Victor Kane's administrative leave was announced internally the following morning in an email from Dr. Marsh's office that used the language institutional emails always used, pending review, temporary measure, commitment to thorough process, and communicated in its careful neutrality exactly how serious the situation was, because Renata Marsh was a precise administrator and her word choices were never accidental. The email went to all department heads. By 9 a.m., it had been read by everyone who worked in the building. By 10 a.m., the Michigan settlement had been confirmed by legal. By noon, a second settlement from a hospital in Colorado had been located in the same database. The third, the one the anonymous text had mentioned, which turned out to be from a clinic in rural Tennessee, took 2 more days to surface because the NDA had been processed through a private arbitration firm rather than a standard legal channel, and the paper trail required a specific kind of database access that Hargrove's legal team hadn't known to request until Cross's office flagged it. 3 settlements, 12 years of practice. A pattern of clinical record alteration following patient outcomes Kane had mismanaged, settled quietly in exchange for his departure, the institutions choosing the path that cost less in the immediate term without understanding what they were passing to the next place. The Michigan case was the most complete. A nurse named Delaney Kraft had filed the original complaint, had held to it through 2 rounds of institutional pressure to withdraw, and had ultimately accepted the settlement when her attorney told her that her career would not survive a full public proceeding against a physician with Kane's institutional standing. She had left nursing entirely. She was, as of the date of the Colorado settlement, working at a landscaping company in upstate Michigan and had not, as far as anyone knew, looked back. Olivia got this information from Sandra, who had gotten it from legal, who had gotten it from the database, and she sat with it in the hospital break room on a Wednesday afternoon with a coffee she wasn't drinking and thought about Delaney Craft and what it cost to be right, when being right didn't have enough structural support around it. She thought about the 12 years between the Michigan complaint and this Tuesday in Caldwell, the patients in those 12 years, the records that had been adjusted, the outcomes that had been reframed, the clinical truth that had been edited into a more favorable shape. She thought about her own nursing notes from 11:58 p.m. on the night of the 14th. Still in the chart. Still time-stamped. Kane had added his addendum, but he hadn't deleted hers, and she thought that was probably because he'd understood, in some functional part of his processing, that deleting a time-stamped nursing entry in a patient chart was a line that, once crossed, had a specific name. He'd added instead, characterized, reframed, the way he'd always done it. She finished the coffee even though it was cold, rinsed the cup, and went back to work. The medical board's formal notification went out on Friday. Kane's license was placed under review, a process that the board's communications officer told Marsh would take approximately 6 weeks, but that had, attached to it, a practice restriction that took effect immediately, which meant that Victor Kane could not practice medicine at any institution in the state until the review concluded. He came to the hospital once, on the Thursday between the administrative leave and the board notification. Olivia wasn't there. She was on a day shift that had started at 6, and she was in Bay 4 with a man who had managed to break his wrist in a way that was genuinely creative, and she didn't see Kane arrive or leave. Sandra told her later that he'd come to collect personal items from his office, and that he'd done so quickly, with the energy of a man who wanted to be through the building before the building fully registered him, which was a specific kind of diminishment in a person who had spent a decade and a half treating institutional spaces as personal property. She didn't have a feeling about this that she could identify cleanly. She had expected to feel something more defined, satisfaction or closure, or the particular release of a thing that had been held too long finally being set down. What she actually felt was more complicated and less cinematic, a low-grade residual anger at the system that had moved him from Michigan to Colorado to Tennessee to Caldwell without anyone doing the arithmetic, sitting alongside something that might have been tiredness and might have been, at its edges, the early stages of something like peace. None of those things were complete. They were all present at the same time, which was how most of the important things felt in her experience, not clean, not resolved into a single emotion, but layered and simultaneous and more honest for it. The federal case against Martin Greer was filed 11 days after his detention. The documentation was extensive. The archived logs, Olivia's deposition, the testimony of the NCO who had managed the unofficial extractions in 2018 and had been sitting on his own records for 3 years waiting for a structure in which they could be used. His name was Raymond Pulaski. He was 53, recently retired from a civilian contracting role, and he had, according to Cross, memorized the contents of the documents he was holding because he'd been afraid the physical copies would be found. Olivia did not meet Pulaski in person until 2 weeks after the filing, in a conference room in the federal building, in a meeting that Cross had arranged and then made himself scarce for correctly reading that some conversations required institutional personnel to be absent. Pulaski was a large man with a careful manner and the specific quality of stillness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had learned to move around it rather than with it. He stood when she came in, which was not something she'd expected, and he said, "Ms. Hayes," and then stopped, as if he'd prepared something and found, now that she was in the room, that it didn't fit the actual dimensions of the moment. "Sit down," she said. She sat. He sat. She looked at him. He was doing the same, and she could see the recognition running through him. Not of her face, which he'd never seen, but of her existence, which he'd been protecting at a distance for 6 years and had never known whether to believe was actually intact. "The others," she said. He nodded. "I tried. The 2 extraction windows the morning after. I used every contact I had. 3 people came out." He looked at his hands, which were flat on the table. I couldn't build a third window in time. I know, she said. I've been over it. I know, she said again. Not to stop him. Just because it was true, and because he needed to hear that it was heard, and because she had spent enough time in the margins of that night to understand what the variables had been, and what the realistic constraints were, and where the actual fault line ran, which was not through Raymond Pulaski's decisions, but through a keystroke that Martin Greer had made at 23:41 on April 19, 2018. Pulaski looked at her. You kept the records, she said. Seemed like the least I could do. It was more than that. She held his gaze. It was enough. He breathed. It was the specific breath of someone who had been holding something at a specific tension for a very long time and had just been told by someone with the standing to say it that they could let it out. He didn't cry because he was a 53-year-old retired military contractor in a federal building, and that wasn't how it moved through him. But his face changed, and she watched it change, and she let it. They talked for an hour. Operational specifics, chronology, the documentation chain, the practical material of people who were building a case record together. But also the other kind of talking, the kind that didn't have an official category, that happened when two people who had been part of the same event from different angles finally occupied the same room and allowed the event to be real between them in a way it couldn't be in isolation. When she left the federal building, the afternoon had gone to early evening, the sky doing the thing it did in late fall in Caldwell when the light went warm and amber before it went away. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment in that light and didn't do anything in particular. But 6 weeks after the medical board's notification, Victor Kane's license was suspended for 18 months, with conditions attached to any future reinstatement that the board's report characterized as substantial. The report was a public document. It described a pattern of clinical record alteration across multiple institutions, identified 3 specific cases, and noted the formal finding that Kane had filed a materially inaccurate addendum to a patient record at Hargrove Regional Medical Center on the night of the 14th. The finding was specific about the addendum's inaccuracy. It cited the time-stamped nursing notes filed at 11:58 p.m. It cited the patient outcome. It used the word falsification, which was a word the board did not use in its reports, unless the evidence made any other word inadequate. Delaney Craft's original complaint from Michigan was referenced in a footnote. Just a footnote. The board's jurisdiction didn't extend to relitigating settled cases. But it was there, in the public record, with her name attached to it, which meant that the thing she had seen and documented and tried to bring forward 12 years ago was now officially part of the story of what Victor Kane was. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the kind of thing that mattered in ways that didn't announce themselves loudly. Olivia read the report in the break room on a Thursday afternoon and then put her phone away and went back to Bay 3, where there was a 14-year-old girl who'd been brought in after a fall at soccer practice and who was trying very hard not to cry about the pain in her ankle while also trying very hard to seem unbothered by the hospital environment, which she clearly found stressful, and Olivia sat with her while they waited for imaging and talked about nothing in particular. The game, the team, a coach, the girl obviously found frustrating. And the girl's breathing gradually settled and her shoulders came down, and by the time the imaging tech arrived, she had stopped gripping the side of the bed. That was Tuesday. The work was Tuesday. Martin Greer was indicted on 4 counts: federal records falsification, obstruction of a military investigation, conspiracy, and attached in a supplemental filing 3 weeks after the initial indictment, negligent homicide, which the prosecuting attorney's office had added after a lengthy review of what the canceled extraction authorization had meant for the 3 people who had not come back from the April 2018 operation. Negligent homicide was a charge that was going to be argued, contested, refined through months of legal process that Olivia would be called to contribute to and couldn't predict the precise outcome of. But it was there. It was filed. The 3 names were in it. The casualty records for those 3 were amended by the military through a separate administrative process that moved, for once, faster than anyone had expected. Cross told her it was because someone at the right level had made it a priority. And she didn't ask who, because the answer mattered less than the outcome. The families were formally notified. The original casualty reports, the ones that said navigation error, were superseded. What the new record said was the truth, which was that these were 3 military personnel who had died because an authorized extraction was canceled without operational justification, and whose deaths had been subsequently obscured through deliberate record manipulation. The truth didn't bring anyone back. She knew that in the specific way you knew things that didn't help you, but that were still true. It didn't make the amended record meaningless. It made it something else, the minimum necessary acknowledgement, the floor below which decency couldn't go. She attended the notification briefing for one family, the parents of Corporal Jesse Moran, 24 years old at the time of the operation, from a small city in central Ohio. She attended as a witness, not as a presenter, sitting in a federal office with Cross and Adler and the family's liaison, and she watched the parents receive the information that their son had not died because of a navigational error, that he had been where he was supposed to be and done what he'd been asked to do, and that the system had failed him in a specific, preventable, human-caused way. His father was a large man with Jesse's same coloring who sat very still while Adler spoke and then said, at the end, he knew what he was doing, he went anyway. Not as a comfort, as a statement of his son's character that he needed said aloud in an official room. Yes, Olivia said. He did. Jesse's father looked at her. He didn't know the full shape of her role in that night. He knew what the briefing had told him, which was enough. And he looked at her with the specific expression of someone who was trying to take the measure of a stranger across a distance that was both enormous and, in some incommunicable way, not. Thank you, he said, for not letting it stay buried. She didn't have an answer for that. She nodded, and she meant it, and she hoped that translated. 3 months after the federal filing, Renata Marsh called Olivia into her office. Not Conference B, her actual office, with its stacked files and the faded plant in the corner, and the window that faced east and got morning light. She offered coffee, which Olivia accepted, and then she sat behind her desk with the manner of a person who had organized what they wanted to say and was going to say it directly. The hospital is restructuring its trauma protocols, Marsh said, partly in response to the board findings, partly because our outcome data over the last 5 years shows gaps in our behavioral emergency procedures that should have been addressed before now. She paused. I'm building a small team to redesign the training component. Simulation-based, cross-disciplinary. Nurses, residents, security, all in the same room. She looked at Olivia. I want you to lead it. Olivia held the coffee cup. It was a plain institutional mug, white with the hospital's logo, the ceramic warm against her palms. That's a different role than my current one, she said. Yes. I'd still want floor shifts. I assumed you would. We'd structure it so you're in both. Marsh looked at her steadily. What you did in that trauma bay the night Sergeant Voss came in, the behavioral de-escalation, the clinical assessment under pressure, the code management, those aren't things you teach from a textbook. They're things you teach from experience, with someone in the room who's actually done them. A pause. I've been doing this job for 9 years. I know the difference between someone who knows procedures and someone who understands why procedures exist. You're the second kind. I'd like the residents and the nursing staff to learn from someone like that. Olivia looked at the faded plant in the corner. Someone had been watering it inconsistently for what appeared to be years. It had survived, but it was not thriving, which was a particular kind of botanical stubbornness she could respect. She thought about what Voss had said. Make sure it's something you actually want, not just something that's owed. She thought about the 14-year-old with the soccer ankle, and the woman with the panic attack, and the elderly man with the insulin, and the 8-year-old with the asthma, and all the ordinary Tuesday work of caring for people who came through the doors at their worst moments and needed someone in the room who knew what they were doing. She thought about the lockbox under the floorboard, the 2 passports, the 4 phone numbers written in pencil, the photograph she hadn't looked at. She thought about the fact that she'd left it there, all of it, and hadn't opened it since the night Cross had first found her in the parking lot. Not from forgetfulness, from a decision she'd been making slowly, incrementally, without naming it, the way the most important decisions sometimes arrived. Not as a moment, but as a direction you'd been walking in long enough that turning back would require more effort than continuing. I'll do it, she said. Marsh nodded once, without ceremony, the nod of a person who had made a decision they were confident in and didn't need to celebrate it. Good, we'll talk structure next week. Olivia finished the coffee, set the mug on the desk, and stood up. Ms. Hayes. Marsh said it in the way she'd said it in Conference B on the day of the disciplinary hearing, and something about the specific repetition of it, the same name, a different room, a different weight behind it, landed in a place Olivia didn't try to locate precisely. For what it's worth, I'm glad you were in that bay. Olivia looked at her. Renata Marsh, 9 years in this job, the compact authority of someone who chose her words and meant them. So am I, Olivia said. She went to see Voss before his discharge. He was dressed, which made him look more like himself and less like a patient. And he had his bag on the bed and the expression of someone who was acutely ready to leave a building. Heading out, she said. 12 days was 9 days too many. He picked up the bag, shifted it to his right shoulder with the careful management of a man whose left side was still having opinions. I heard about the board report. It's public record. Yeah. He looked at her. And the new role. She raised an eyebrow. Garrett has a big mouth, he said, without apology. She almost laughed. It didn't quite arrive, but it was close, and close was more than she'd managed in a while. It's a good fit, she said. It is. He held her gaze for a moment, and there was something in it that was the accumulated weight of the last 2 weeks, of the conference room and the corridor, and the hour of conversation in the SICU room on the night she'd told him his team had been alert enough to be split between 2 bays. You're staying, he said. Not a question, but not quite a statement either, a thing he was checking quietly because it mattered. I'm staying, she said. He nodded. Then he put his right hand out. She took it. They shook hands the way people shook hands when the gesture meant more than the gesture. Firmly, briefly, without making more of it than it was or less than it was. You saved more than me, he said. She looked at him. Damon Voss, who had ripped an IV line out of his arm in a dark trauma bay and been talked down by a woman nobody in that hospital had thought to look at twice, who had driven his post-operative body to a conference room because he'd wanted to see it, who had said, from a hospital doorway with a repaired spleen and his arm in a sling, she saved my life multiple times, and said it in the specific plain tone of a man stating a fact that the record should contain. Take care of yourself, she said. Working on it. He shifted the bag on his shoulder. You too. He left. She stood in the room for a moment after the sound of his footsteps had faded down the corridor, in the particular quiet of a space after a person has gone from it, the quiet that had its own texture. She moved the lockbox, not to throw it away. She wasn't the kind of person who discarded contingencies, but from the floor of the closet to the shelf above it, which was a small change in position that meant something she didn't need to articulate. The 2 passports stayed. The prepaid phone she turned off and left on the shelf beside them. The 4 phone numbers in pencil she folded into the back of a small notebook she kept in the kitchen for no particular reason. The photograph she took out and looked at for the first time in 3 years. It was a photograph of 7 people in field gear, taken somewhere that was not identifiable from the background, standing in the arrangement of people who had been told to stand together for documentation purposes, and were doing so with the self-consciousness of individuals who didn't particularly like being documented. She was second from the left. She was 25 in the photograph, and she looked younger than that in the specific way people looked younger when they hadn't yet accumulated the particular kind of knowledge that age was often just a proxy for. The 3 who had not come back were all in the photograph. She looked at each of them in turn. She did this without managing what it cost her, because she was alone in the apartment, and there was no one to maintain composure for, and she'd learned, over enough time, that the things you managed past always found another entry point. She let it be what it was. She let it take the time it needed. Then she put the photograph on the shelf, in front of the lockbox where she could see it, and closed the closet door. But she started the new role on a Monday. The first training session had 14 people in it. 4 residents, 6 nurses, 2 security personnel, 1 transport aide, and Marcus Webb, who had requested to be included, which had surprised her until she thought about it, and then it didn't, because Webb had been in that trauma bay too and had watched something happen that didn't match his existing categories, and that kind of cognitive dislocation either made people defensive or curious, and Webb had, apparently, chosen curious. She stood at the front of the simulation room and looked at them. 14 people looking back at her with the mixture of attention and uncertainty that a new context always produced, not knowing yet what this was going to be, what she was going to be in it, whether it was going to be worth the hour. She thought about Delaney Kraft in Michigan, who had seen what was wrong and said so and paid for it. She thought about Raymond Pulaski memorizing documents in case the physical copies were found. She thought about Jesse Marin's father saying he knew what he was doing. He went anyway, in a federal office in Caldwell, with the precision of a man who needed the truth said in an official room. She thought about a trauma bay in which the lights had gone out at 2:47 in the morning and a man on a gurney had stopped screaming, and what had happened in the space that opened up after that. "I'm going to start with a scenario," she said. "Someone comes into your bay in a behavioral crisis. They're combative, they're scared, they don't know where they are, and every instinct they have is telling them the room is a threat. Standard protocol says chemical sedation and physical restraint. I want to tell you when standard protocol is the wrong answer and what you do instead." She looked at the room. "And I want you to be able to tell me why it's wrong, not because I said so, because you understand the patient in front of you well enough to see the difference between someone who needs to be contained and someone who needs to be met." Webb was writing something down. The others were listening with the alert, slightly forward posture of people who had just realized this was going to be different from what they'd walked in expecting. "The scenario is real," she said. "I was in it. We'll start there." The room was quiet. She had spent 6 years being non-recoverable, annotated that way, filed that way, moving from city to city in the margin between what was on record and what was true. She had done good work in that margin, careful, consistent, effective work. And the work had mattered to the people it reached, but it had been invisible in the structural sense, ungathered, belonging to no record that counted. Her name was Olivia Hayes. She was 31 years old. She was standing in a training room in a hospital in Caldwell, and the people in front of her were going to learn things that would move through the rest of their careers and into every room